Hi to Al and all the members of the team from Linda Island in New South Wales, where I'm on a different time zone. I've heard it mentioned on more than one occasion that the analysis of poetry by a reader is a creative act within itself.
She just said that she's heard it said that the act of analysis of close reading is a creative act in itself.
This must be a new idea to people in this course who might be struggling to pin a poem down to a single definitive interpretation. Joe and the panel, what is your take on this idea of the reading of a poem being a creative act? Do poets of published works celebrate such openness? Who owns the ideas in a published poem once it enters the public domain? Thank you and all the best.
That's Linda Ireland calling from Australia. Katie, could you move like 6 inches to your right so I can see my friends in the Google Hangout? Okay, so I would like a few people to answer that question. I would say Max, Lily, and Joe. Would you take a crack at the question, can interpretation be creative? I know Lily has thought about this a lot, so why don't you start, Lil?
Yeah, I actually think that this is kind of what we mean when we talk about poems that invite the reader to take a step towards them in making meaning in interpretation, rather than poems that kind of like just have objective meaning that we're supposed to kind of decipher and figure out on our own or something. So like this idea that the space between this, like the poem takes a step forward and you take a step towards the poem and then you create some meaning there. So like it's important to bring other people with you in that step because, you know, you can collaboratively make a lot more meaning out of the, like, I guess bottom line, that sounded probably kind of crazy. But I think of this all in like sort of a geometric or like landscape type of a reading where like the poem creates a space for meaning making, but isn't necessarily delimiting the only space that's there.
Very well put. Could you, since we're going to turn to Max, would you give Eric the mic?
Oh yeah, Jason has the mic.
And sorry, Jason. And Eric, when we come around, I hope you can say briefly something about that space, because I think you and I, a number of people, believe that the collective act of interpretation creates what might be called a third space that has its own significance. And I know that we could go on about that, but I wonder if you'll say something briefly about it. Max, Linda Ireland's comment about it sounds, she said some people in ModPo might think it's an odd notion because poetry is supposed to be there and you're supposed to get it and you remain you and the poem remains the poem and the poet remains the poet and there is no merging. And we actually argue something different. So what do you want to say about that?
I think this creativity or this productivity.
We're not getting sound from Max.
Third space is.
Sorry, Max. We can't. Go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Now we can. Start over, please.
I think this creativity or this productivity is evident in the sheer fact. I mean, it's evident in the forums. It's evident just in the history of papers that have been written on literature. I mean, just the conversation we're having here about a short poem like Sid Corman's is potentially thousands of words, if not hundreds of pages or thousands of pages of dialogue, commentary, ideas, all coming from a poem that's like 25 words long or something. So like the size of a tweet. So yeah, there's like, I think that there is just already like a product there. It's essentially creative.
Terrific. Thank you, Max. Joe, you want to take a crack at this? Is it real? Is it just bullshit that we say that the act of interpretation is a co-creation? Is that just a fancy word?
Oh, it's not bullshit at all. It's just true. I mean, it's inevitable that the act of reading anything, whether it's the back of a cereal box or whatever, is a creative act. You're engaged in making meaning with the language that's there. And in poetry, it's just a much more highly intensified process. And for me, it's the pleasure of reading. I wouldn't want a poem to just give me everything and then I could just put it away and that's it.
And yet so much of the common understanding of poetry is like it's a nugget you have in your wallet that you can consult. I think people do carry poems in their wallets. There's nothing wrong with that. But that it becomes a kind of product that you keep your subjectivity and the poem has its objectivity, and once you get it, you got it. And we're saying something really different, and it is kind of countercultural. No? I mean, do you feel like you're in a minority when you say things like, when I engage with Sid, we are creating something together?
No, even people I know, like family members, for instance, who don't really read poetry. They read a poem and they expect to get it right away. But even in their confusion, that's still a creative act. They're trying to figure it out. They're engaging the text.
Yes.
So I think it's just a matter of changing one's perspective. Anybody can read and enjoy poetry.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Eric for his comment in a second, but what I want to do is ask anyone at the table or in the Hangouts, and if you're in the Hangout, just kind of wave at me so I know you have something to say. Can we name some poems this week, 2 or 3 of them, that are very explicit about encouraging co-creation in the act of reading? We've already talked about one, and that's Sid Corman's It Isn't for Want, because many people believe that it's a love poem, but it's also about the crucial nature of the relationship between the reader who's actually there making Sid live, even though he's dead. But are there other poems? Katie Hartman, can you think of one? It's kind of putting you on the spot, sorry. Does anybody have a poem this week that's explicit about co-creation?
The Way. Oh.
The Way. You would pick the hardest one, Emily. Can we bring Emily's sound up a little bit, Chris? Say something brief about The Way.
Yeah, The Way is all about the process of discovering yourself and the process of reading, of creating yourself through reading pretty explicitly.
It's sort of like, in a way, portrait of the writer-reader as a young girl.
Exactly.
And then, okay, that's a good one. Is there another one? Everybody's drawing a blank. Mal? Oh, Davey's got one.
I would make an argument for a supermarket in California.
That's what I was
Whoa! A supermarket in California. Okay,
Because
say why.
You're imagining, because Ginsberg is imagining reading as an embodied experience with another person. And I can't read that poem without thinking about the poem as a body, without thinking about having a subjective relationship between my body as a reader and the poem's
Wow.
body, between
Wow.
Whitman as poet and Whitman as embodied
Wow.
person in a supermarket space.
Can you riff on some grand analogies here? I'll get you started and then go for it. Okay, so Alan is to the lonely old grubber who he fantasizes as Walt. So you have a reader-writer relationship. As what is to what? We who are Ginsberg-like in our longing in conventional America are to that feeling incredibly marginal in a supermarket in the middle of the night. As what is to what? Can we go further with this? Because you're suggesting that we're implicated in that marginality, I think.
Yeah, I think that Ginsberg's readership of Whitman is to an embodied experience of Whitman, as our readership of Ginsberg is to an embodied experience of Ginsberg. So that Ginsberg creates the supermarket space in which he's hanging out with Whitman, and we get a kind of similar material space out of his poem.
Davey, you're amazing. So, I mean, I really haven't thought about this poem in this way. You're creating, it's not just a Modpo lineage, Whitman to Ginsberg to us. It's real. It's like there's a Whitmanian strain in that feeling outside of mainstream society, and Walt is going to give it to us. And the hobo in the supermarket in California in the middle of the night.
So that's also like
Gabe?
a very specific kind of lineage too. Like Whitman to Ginsberg to us is not only like a Modpo lineage, like a syllabus,
Yeah.
but it's also like Ginsberg saw himself as connected to Walt Whitman as like a gay person or some version of a gay person. And he saw himself connected to Whitman in a like quite literal sexual sense. Like Ginsberg talked about how he had sex with this guy who had sex with this guy who had sex with this guy. And if you trace it back far enough, you'd get to Whitman. And so he like quite literally saw himself as like having sex with Walt Whitman in the reading space.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a very short lineage. It's actually
It's a short
surprisingly
lineage.
short.
That's
lineage.
right. Eric knows the, I don't know if we call this literary history, but the sexio literary history. One more. I'll throw, Katie. Yeah.
Say something?
Yes.
Sure.
Katie
Hi.
Hartman, you're on.
I was gonna say the Niedecker Poet's Work poem. I think like
Poet's work.
obviously that poem is about poet's work, as the title suggests, and I think that in calling the act of writing poem her trade, it's sort of implying that there's a product and the poem is the product, and the product wouldn't work as a trade if there wasn't someone to consume it and there wasn't a relationship between the people who
Wow.
were engaging in it.
Cool. So there's exchange going on. So Lorraine Niedecker there isn't being just straight out anti-capitalist to grandpa. She's saying, I got my own exchange of value going on, and it depends on the reader encountering this poem because that's an exchange, because I'm making a useful product. Wow, that was really cool. And then one more, and then Eric, and that is, of course, remember we're talking about the reader? Of course, you are my friend. If that's not like Sid saying it isn't for want of something to say, but to detain you, you are my friend. So you are my friend may be her own hand, it may be her husband Al or somebody she goes fishing with, but it also might be us, because we are inside the mending kit too.